Welcome to Life Beyond Abortion, the podcast where we delve into the untold stories and experiences surrounding abortion. Stories often missing from everyday conversations, media reports, and even other podcast interviews. I'm your host, Melissa Ohden, the founder and CEO of the Abortion Survivors Network. As the author of You Carried Me, A Daughter's Memoir, and Abortion Survivors Break Their Silence, I've had the privilege of hearing the most powerful stories from some of the most resilient and courageous individuals. These stories and these people have profoundly transformed my life, and I believe they have the power to transform yours as well. Together, we will amplify these voices, share the truths that they illuminate, and challenge our culture to recognize what life is truly like beyond abortion. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Life Beyond Abortion. I've got to tell you, this is a conversation I have been looking forward to for a couple of months now. I want to introduce you today to a woman whose story and experiences, both personally and professionally, I think challenge many people when it comes to their perception and understanding of abortion and life beyond abortion. And I also think you're just going to be super encouraged by how she has used those experiences to become who she is today. I want to introduce you to Rebecca Hagan. I have the great opportunity to call you Becky in my life, but Rebecca, Becky, thank you for joining me.
Melissa, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I can't even remember the first time you and I ever really met. I mean, I can age myself pretty quickly. I think you were young. You're still young. Okay, we're young together, but we're growing in wisdom. And I think that's just where I want to start. What do you want people to know about you and your life?
Oh my word, that's a loaded question. Well, I remember the first time that we met, it was at the Pro-Life Women's Conference. We were on a panel together, and you had been in this ministry for a number of years at that point, and I think I was 19 or 20, and much like you had just kind of got thrust into this ministry and this movement, and at first you don't really know what exactly you're doing, but you're just saying, God, I'm willing to be used, which I think, Melissa, is a lot like your story. And here we are, and it's probably been 10 years or so since we've met, and a lot has happened. I have been in this ministry for about that long, started shortly after my second child was born, and really after my life was dramatically changed, interrupted, transformed by the pro-life, pro-love movement.
Well, and I can remember, Becky, as you're talking about the first time we sort of really met, because I think that's how it works a lot of times in the pro-life movement. We see each other from afar and we learn people's stories by, I think, what we read about them or videos that we watch or, hearing from other people. And I remember where we were standing at that women's conference, and I know what you asked me. Do you remember what you asked me that day? It's pretty personal, but I think it's a lead into your experience.
No. What did I ask you?
You said to me that day, it was essentially, I'm afraid of what my son may think or feel when he finds out his story. Right. I mean, I'm not covering your words as eloquently as you did, but that was your question, right? Of what is he going to think? What is he going to feel when he knows? And I think that is a common concern for so many people, no matter what, our story is as a parent, but also then how it's deeply connected to our child's story. So if you don't mind, let's share with the audience, what's your family's life beyond abortion story?
Yeah, so our life beyond abortion story started when it was just me, when I was just a little teenager thinking I had the world figured out. And that attitude caught up to me, landed me in my first unplanned pregnancy at 17, newly 17, tail end of my junior year. And I chose life for that baby. I like to say, and it's the truth, that in that circumstance, the hope won out. The hope was loud. And I just thought, we can do this, my baby and I. And we did. And unfortunately, though I chose life and though my life got better in some ways, I graduated from high school, I went on to a university, it looked like I was thriving. Behind closed doors, nothing changed. And you know, Melissa, because you hear these stories, you've been in this movement longer than I have, you know, history repeats itself when there's not some type of dramatic life turnaround. And so history repeated itself, and less than a year after having my first baby as a teenager, I found out I was pregnant again. And this time there was no hope. The hope was not loud. Instead, the fear won out. And not just fear, but the shame and the what will people think. And then the world, you know, tells young people that, you know, what quality of life will you have if you have another baby at 18 years old? What quality of life will your children have if they're born to a teenage mother and you have to drop out of school and you live in poverty and there's not a dad around because their father was out of the picture at that point? And we don't talk at all about sanctity of life. And so in my lowest moment, I started searching for a way out. And, you know, right before we do something dumb or out of character, we get desperate. And I was desperate. And so I did something out of character. I grew up in a Christian home. I, on paper, knew better, but I thought this has to end with me. If I have another baby, another child, if I go through another pregnancy, my children will suffer, I will suffer. My parents, who had extended grace the first time around but made sure to tell me there could never be a next time, they didn't deserve this. They would endure pain and suffering and embarrassment. They'd kick me out. And so all of that led me to believe that abortion was the answer.
Well, and that point that you just made is so powerful. And I want to pause there for a second because I want to make sure the audience really hears this. I call this the when the rubber hits the road moments. And, you know, I had a pastor use those same words recently, and I thought there's really something to that because your point, Becky, of when we are going to, when we do something that is out of character, out of right, our typical way of being or the way that we have been raised, it comes from a place of despair. And I think I want people to recognize that because I think sometimes even though in our movement we can believe in the sanctity of life and believe in supporting, you know, women of all ages in a time of pain or desperation, I think sometimes there's this disconnect, right? When people will pop off things and say, oh, well, you know, why doesn't she just, right? How could she? And I want people to pause there for a minute and think, you were living in a home raised with Christian beliefs. You were supported, right? You are a woman of character. You always have been. People of character make mistakes, especially in times of right growth as teenagers. Our brains are developing, all those things. And despair drives us to make choices we wouldn't otherwise that go against what we know to be good and true.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you were in this place of despair thinking all the things that you just talked about, right? I can't do this to my first son. I can't do this to my family. I can't do this to me. There's got to be some other quote unquote choice. And so when you went searching, Becky, what did you find?
Yeah, so I went searching and I had already made up in my mind, like I said, that, you know, parenting was out of the question. I couldn't continue this pregnancy. That would mean the end of my parents' relationship with me. It would mean that we would lose our home. We'd be homeless. We'd be poor. We'd have no food. We'd have no money. All the things that my parents had kind of promised would happen if I ever let this scenario repeat itself. And I knew I couldn't choose adoption because women in this position so often, as crazy as this seems now, being on the other side of it and not being in crisis mode, I can think clearly, but women in this predicament, you know, we want finality. We want it to be over. We want to close this door and never look back. And with adoption, that's really not possible because a child is going to one day probably want to know where I am, what the circumstances were regarding their conception and why they were placed, and all of these unknowns and the fear of having a child out there that belonged to me that I wasn't raising. You know, adoption is beautiful, but in that crisis-filled moment, it was so scary. And then there was abortion, and abortion was not what I wanted to do. It was what I thought I had to do. And so that's really how good Christian girls who know better end up in these predicaments. And Melissa, you really hit the nail on the head. I think that, yeah, fear and desperation lead us to do things that are out of character. And sometimes I think that those of us who grow up in really great homes where there's a lot of expectations on us and we're achievers and we've done well, like the stakes for me are high. I cannot mess up, and I for sure cannot mess up twice. Whereas maybe people think that somebody in that situation would not choose abortion. I think that the likelihood of her choosing abortion is even greater because she's got more to protect when it comes to her identity, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Ooh, that is, I mean, there's another one to press pause on. Knowing how important this conversation is, Becky, that is, I mean, another really, I think, surprising point for people to wrap their head around, which is, right, those of us who are raised with firm Christian upbringing and, you know, knowledge about the sanctity of life, that, yeah, that almost, right, instead of being a sort of a protective factor, protecting you from making that decision, in some ways, yes, it does, obviously, because it's a place from which we like drive our being. But you're right that it becomes this factor that can influence people to want to self-protect even further when we don't match all of that. And I think there is a lot of tension, a lot of obstacles to living that out day by day. I often tell my kids, you know, you don't live in a bubble. And as much as even me as a parent would love for them to live in a bubble, that they wouldn't develop into who God created them to be. But we want that bubble because we know that life unfolds in such a way that if you're not in the bubble, something's going to bump up against you. And, you know, that's when the rubber hits the road. And I'm sure you've heard some of the things I have, Becky, especially when I go to like Christian high schools. You know, young women will whisper to me and say, you know, I knew that abortion was wrong, but I knew I couldn't come back to my Christian school pregnant. And so even though I knew it was wrong, I went ahead and had that abortion because then it's just between me and God. And to me, that is utterly heartbreaking. But I also understand the dynamic of it, of thinking, man, if it's just between God and I, at least then I'm not causing shame to my family, right? I'm not causing problems in my interpersonal relationships with my family, whatever it is. What would you say to a young woman right now, maybe who's listening to this, who is going through that?
Yeah, and I do hear that a lot at Christian high schools. And something I say, no matter where I'm speaking, is when I was in this predicament, one of the things that helped me justify my decision to have an abortion was, you know, I'm a Christian, I'm in church actively, was in church a couple of days ago in an abortion clinic. Now, God is just going to have to forgive me on this one. And he will, because I serve a good and forgiving dad. And I'd rather face my heavenly father later than face my earthly father now. And I think that is exactly what you're talking about. Young women and young men express those same sentiments, and they're terrified. And I think what I've learned and what I try to express to young people is, if you are driving a wedge between your relationship with God, trying to impress your teacher, your coach, your friends, even your parents, you've missed the mark. You've messed up. You're making the wrong decision if you win the approval of everyone around you, even your family, but disobey God. And your parents, while they may not be able to express this because they don't have the tools or the words, would never want you, if they're believers, if they're solid Christians, would never want you to do something that would cause you to intentionally stray away from the Lord. And yes, they're going to be upset that you're pregnant. And yes, they're going to be shocked. They are people after all. But I promise you, because I've lived through this, that all of you can get through it.
Yeah, that's the adage, isn't it? Right. That I want people to understand is abortion is a permanent decision. And as much as people think that, yeah, if I do this, it's just between God and I, and nobody's ever going to know. It impacts your life in the day to day, it impacts
Yeah.
your eternity. And, God has this way of bringing about good in the circumstances that we're in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. So,
Amen.
right, it's the enemy that fills us with that fear of, yeah, nobody should ever know this. What a problem you are. This is a mistake, right? You need to make this decision. And what an opportunity it is, even though it's hard, right? In the middle of the what feels like this mistake, this sin that you just want to make go away as quickly as you can. Long term, you see such grace, the work that God does. So tell us what happened next when you were in that place of despair.
Yeah, yeah. So I went looking for an abortion, and you will find what you go looking for, especially with having access to the internet. I didn't have to look far. I lived in Northern California at the time, and abortion was everywhere. In fact, at that time, within about a 30-mile radius of where I lived near Sacramento, there were 8 abortion providers. And so this sends the message, I think, to young girls in a community and young men that this is something the people here support. This is normal. I grew up driving past abortion providers every day, essentially. And even though I hadn't yet needed them, it just was a known presence in the community, I guess you could say. And so I didn't have to look far. And while also online, because you have access to everything, just the palm of your hand, I was able to find out that there was a new, more modern, more natural, or so they say, way to end a pregnancy. And that is, of course, through chemical abortion. And chemical abortion, even back in 2013, when I was going through this, was marketed as, safe, less invasive. They call it medication abortion and medicinal abortion and pill abortion and the abortion pill. And it all seems very appealing. To a young person, you start thinking, well, this really isn't that bad. I'm not having a surgical procedure, so I'm not really ending a life, and I'm not sedated. I mean, how problematic could taking a couple of pills be? The same way I take an Advil for a problem headache, well, I'll just take these abortion pills for a problem pregnancy. And you start believing that you can just be unpregnant. And we both know that that's physiologically impossible, but it does fulfill, I think, an emotional need. Somebody that probably couldn't bring themselves to have a surgical abortion is able to make that decision a whole lot easier when it comes to chemical abortion, because you just think it's not real, and it's not really even a baby. I'm just ending a pregnancy. And so that's what I chose.
Well, and I think that's an important point as well. When, we know the lies of the abortion industry and their lobby and how successful they are at their messaging. And, right, you're just going to pop a pill like any other pill. And again, I want people to sort of put themselves in your shoes, in the shoes of other women, because people could go, Becky, you're smart. You already had a baby. You know how this works. But when we are in a place of crisis, we are using like a different part of our brain kicks in, right? It is not our rational, right? It is
Right.
not rational when we are thinking in a time of crisis. It is very much, right, fight or flight. Like, what's the quickest way to get through this, what feels like a matter of life and death for yourself? And we know, yes, it's a matter of life and death for that baby. But when you're in that place, right, you're thinking about yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also thinking about this baby, because as crazy as this sounds, what kind of life would they have? What kind of life would the baby that I already have here on earth that's suffering have? And I know that's not a Christian thought. I shouldn't have been thinking like that, but you do, in a twisted way, start to believe that this is a compassionate, adult-like, sacrificial decision for me and for the children involved, as wild as that seems.
And I thank you for sharing that, because I know it's not easy to talk about, right? Those of us with these stories, they are very, very vulnerable. And, you have been sort of at the forefront in the movement of being a woman who knows the truth about abortion and how it impacts women's lives and children's lives, and being courageous and bold in being so vulnerable. So I want to be clear that, I appreciate you and how honest and forthcoming you are, because it's not easy to do. I know that.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that, and I'm grateful that we've been friends for as long as we've been friends, because I think it's because of you and people like you that you have some encouragement in your corner and you're able to continue sharing. So
Yeah, and we know that great good comes from our vulnerability, but yeah, it's definitely not easy to do and easy to unpack. So, I mean, that leads us to the next part of your experience. You discovered abortion pills. It sounded like it was probably as quick and easy as the abortion industry likes to make it out to be, and you obtained them and took them.
Yeah, absolutely, sure did. And they're super easy to obtain, especially now with telehealth and mail order abortion. Anyone under 18, even people who aren't pregnant, can obtain abortion pills. These are women who, or young girls who've never seen a doctor, who've never had an ultrasound. Now, in my case, I did have an ultrasound and I saw not a doctor, but I had an in-clinic chemical abortion. And I'll never forget sitting there and just soaking in this 60-second elevator speech of what was supposed to happen. That I would take one pill, the abortion pill, mifepristone, and that it would end my pregnancy. And in a hyped up, short moment, you don't think to ask, how does that work? How do you end a pregnancy? And, I don't want to blame it on being young and dumb, but I was only 18. And so I didn't think, how does a pill end a pregnancy? I just thought my problem will be over and I could go back to normal. And then they said, 24 hours later, you'll take a second set of pills called misoprostol or Cytotec, and that it will expel your pregnancy. And I didn't think to pause and say, what does that mean? How do you, expel a pregnancy? What does the word expel even, what will happen? You just think that you're going to, this problem's going to go away. And I had no idea that I was being instructed to literally send myself into hard, fast labor, because this is the same drug, as you know, commonly given to induce women at full term. It causes their body to dilate, to contract. I had no idea that I'd be turning my bathroom into a place of trauma. And I took that first abortion pill, was told there was no going back, that my pregnancy would soon end. And I just looked down and felt so much shame. And I walked out of that abortion clinic and got to my car, which only took a minute, 2 minutes tops. And I am in disbelief at what I had just done. Like I said, I was in church just a few days prior. The realization, because up to this point, I'm numb. I'm trying to compartmentalize. I'm telling myself it's just fine, don't matter. You have to do this. There's no going back. Well, now it's done. And I'm thinking, what did I just do? And I'm crying and I start praying and I said, God, if there's a way out of this, please help me find it. And if not, Father, just please forgive me. And it dawned on me, and this is kind of my tipping point, that the following day, the day I was supposed to complete the abortion, to take the labor-inducing pills, was my older son's first birthday, March 14th. And I thought, oh my gosh, tomorrow is forever going to be a day that I brought one child into this world and took another one out. And I was undone. I mean, I was just on a mission from that point, and after praying, to try to remedy my mistake.
God has this way of showing up, right? I'm sure whether you could acknowledge it or not, you felt the pressure of one son turning one, right? Of, oh man, I need to take care of this. But yet, right, on the flip side, that's the power of the Holy Spirit, where when we're like, oh, that's going to be the driving force. And God is like, And I'm going to remind you of the importance and the sanctity of that being a situation, right? Instead of being the
Yeah,
stressor. So
agreed.
here you're starting to be filled with regret. And what happens next? I mean, what does someone do when they've taken the first set of abortion pills, Becky, and they're filled with regret?
So thankfully, I did pray this time before turning to my phone. I think so often everybody goes to Google before we go to God, and it lands us in a whole lot of trouble. Just because you can find it doesn't mean you should. In this scenario, however, I typed in, I started a medication abortion, or I took the first abortion pill and I don't want to finish it. And to my surprise, girls just like me, since the FDA approved this chemical abortion regimen in the early 2000s, they'd Googled the exact same search. They too were desperate. So it wasn't just me being crazy and having a sudden change of heart. It was fairly common, but the answers they received were, you have to finish what you started. And I was determined to at least to try not to finish what I had started. And these days, women, technology's advanced, and I find that in the women I talk to, they're Googling very similar searches, but things like, does the abortion pill fail? Can I throw up the first abortion pill? What happens if I only take the first abortion pill? And thankfully, search engine optimization has made this a little easier. They don't have to search as long as I did, but eventually I did find hope through a website called abortionpillreversal.com. And it was really neat because that website had just launched. It had just launched within like 10 weeks of me calling. And so I called, and I didn't know who would be on the other line. Would it be Christians that would pray for me or yell at me? Would it be someone that would ask for my credit card? I had no money. I'm a broke college freshman with a baby. What can you possibly do for me? And I called and I spoke to a pregnancy help organization and a nurse who talked me off, alleged. She asked me questions that abortion providers never did. Like, who are you and how'd you get here and what's your home life like? And do you know what a medication abortion is? And do you know anything about the pill you've taken? And she began to tell me, and this is true, that, the first abortion pill, which I had already ingested, is a progesterone antagonist. Babies in the womb need progesterone, sort of like how we need oxygen. And without it, pregnancies stop, babies die. There's no easy way for me to say that. I had already taken that. And that the second set of pills are labor inducing. And she said, well, maybe if we just put progesterone back into your body, we could put you on a very similar regimen to what we give women who have a tendency to miscarry. We could outcompete the abortion pill and you could sustain your pregnancy. Would you let us try? And I felt like someone, as I'm drowning, was throwing me a life raft. So I'm like, yes, absolutely. I will try. I will drive to the ends of the earth. And so we found a provider a couple of hours away. I was that provider's first patient. And he just said, basically, I have hope. I haven't seen this before, but I'm praying for you. Obviously, he was a physician. I trust progesterone. I use it all the time in my practice. I'm not sure if this will work, but I do believe this is safe. You're not putting your body in danger, essentially. And so we went on a heavy dose of progesterone that I stayed on for several weeks.
And I just want to pause for a minute to just recognize like how courageous not only that doctor was, I mean, Dr. Delgado and everyone who are right the driving forces behind abortion pill reversal, but how courageous, Becky, for you, because here you are going from being scared, wanting the quote unquote right problem to go away, at the same time being balanced with wanting to save your baby's life. That is, I mean, that's a pretty precarious place to exist in. It takes a lot of strength in that moment.
You're very kind. I think that's probably the Lord. And I think, I feel so bad for these women who are opting for abortion. And during that time, myself included, you're trying to suppress your maternal instincts. You're trying to tell yourself, it's mind over matter. This is what's best for me. It's what's best for this baby. I can't feel, I can't think. And then you take the abortion pill, and all of a sudden it was like, this sounds so childish and silly, but my mama bear protection instincts kicked in. And I basically said, I'll do whatever it takes to try to save this baby. And that is what it means to be a mom, to be a parent. It just took me longer for that maternal instinct to kick in with this child, but it did kick in. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. So I give him the credit for that.
I mean, that's our natural instinct, right? That's what the world tries to tell women is not normal, right? That it's suppressible, that our abortion impacted culture would say that that's not even a thing, right? You don't have a maternal instinct when you're pregnant because it's not yet a human being. But we know there is a basis for us having that drive. And you ultimately were able to kick into it by the grace of God, despite having started an abortion. And there's incredible hope and encouragement to be found in that for other women.
Yeah.
So they start you on.
There is, absolutely.
You start on progesterone, and what happens, Becky? Highs and lows.
Oh my goodness. So you have to think, every time I coughed during that pregnancy, I thought, this is it. This is the consequence of my actions. I'm losing the baby. And if there was a sudden ache, the entire time I'm afraid. I'm trusting the Lord and I've given it to him, but I am petrified that something is going to happen, primarily because when I let the abortion providers know that I had changed my mind, I didn't return to the clinic where they do the follow-up ultrasound, which, by the way, women don't even have to have anymore, but 10 years ago you did. I didn't show up, and I said, I'm taking steps to undo the abortion pill. I've changed my mind. I'm trying to reverse this. I'm trying to save my pregnancy. They said, do you have any idea what you're doing? And my honest response was, no, not really. I'm just living on a prayer. And they were so upset. They said, if you carry to term, which is not likely, you'll probably miscarry in the coming days. But if you do, you probably will have a baby born with severe fetal anomalies. So now I'm thinking my entire pregnancy as a young, stressed out, single 18-year-old mother of two who's carrying a baby that, has survived this incredible circumstance, who I'm trying to save, is going to be born, but born with a severe fetal anomaly, which is not the end of the world, that I will have to explain one day is because of a decision I made. And that was terrifying.
Yeah, that's a common concern of women who reach out to us at the Abortion Survivors Network, who say, right, what kind of harm have I done to my baby? And as we look at repeat abortion, particularly after abortion pill failure, we know that women have grave concerns that aren't being answered by medical professionals. So you lived a very systemic problem early on before this became sort of this known issue in our world today. Becky's story is such a powerful one. And I know Becky and I started with really the whole story of the question that she had for me as a parent, which was, what is my child going to think or feel when they know their story? And I want to encourage you to visit Becky's website. So go to RebeccaHagan.com. You can also visit the Abortion Survivors Network's website, abortionsurvivors.org, to learn more about abortion pill reversal and how hundreds of babies a year survive successful abortion pill reversal. And that means that hundreds of women like Becky every year find great hope. The great question is whether women know that they can go through what Becky did and take progesterone to save the pregnancy, which is saving their baby and giving them hope. Becky's story is so beautiful. And I just want to thank Becky again for being a courageous spokesperson for a very vulnerable experience, one that women are going through still today. So catch more of Becky's story on abortionsurvivors.org or on her website. And if you ever want to book Becky as a speaker, I can tell you that she is one of the most impactful speakers, not only at high schools, but also fundraisers as well for pregnancy centers. Becky, thank you again for sharing such an important and vulnerable story, one that is filled with hope. Because when I think about abortion pill reversal, I think about your surviving son and you.
Life Beyond Abortion is a podcast presentation of the Herzog Foundation. The views and opinions on the show are those of the host and her guest, and not necessarily those of the Herzog Foundation. You can find out more about Melissa's work at melissaohden.com or by following her on Instagram at melissaohden. Be sure to like and subscribe to the show so that you never miss an episode of Life Beyond Abortion.